All right, y'all, we are back with another episode of the Appalachian Psychedelic Society podcast. Today's guest is Ethan Nadelmann, and y'all, I am super excited to bring Ethan on. I think he has a lot of information relevant to Appalachia and to the world. Okay. Ethan is described by the Rolling Stone as the point man for drug policy reform efforts and the real drug czar. Ethan Nadelmann, JD, PhD, is widely regarded as the outstanding proponent of the drug policy reform in the United States and abroad. After teaching politics and public affairs at Princeton from 1987 to 1994, he founded and directed the first Lindesmith Center from 94 to 2000. Then the Drug Policy Alliance from 2000 until 2017. He also co-founded the Open Society Institute's International Harm Reduction Development Program. Ethan has published extensively and spoken publicly in roughly 40 states and 40 countries. His TED Talk, Why We Need to End the War on Drugs, has over 2 million views. Ethan and his colleagues were at the forefront of dozens of successful campaigns to legalize marijuana, reduce incarceration of drug law offenders, advance harm reduction approaches to drug use and addiction, and otherwise promote alternatives to punitive prohibitionist drug policies. He played a key role as drug policy advisor to prominent philanthropists, as well as elected officials ranging from mayors, governors, and state and federal legislators in the U.S. to presidents and cabinet ministers outside of the United States. He hosts the leading podcasts about all things drugs, Psychoactive, and he has become increasingly engaged in the debate over tobacco harm reduction. He's currently working on a book, part memoir, part history of the drug policy reform movement, part lessons for activists, part reflections on the big questions and debates in the field. I think y'all are going to love this podcast. Let's go ahead and dive in. And welcome to the Appalachian Psychedelic Society podcast. As we just mentioned, our guest today is Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan, I'm really excited to have you on today. I think you're going to have a lot of context for people when it comes to drug history, especially around opioids. Many of us in Appalachia have faced tremendous hardship when it comes to the opioid epidemic. But I think there's a lot of context that many folks are not aware of. And I'm really excited to just dig into your being able to articulate drug history and the context of opioids, but also anything surrounding cannabis and anything like that. Before we hop into the depths, how are you, Ethan? Where are you calling in from?
Yeah, no, I'm doing great, Justin. It was a pleasure to meet you at that psychedelics conference in New York City. I think it was last year. Yeah, so I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, New York City. It's where I was born, grew up in the suburbs, and moved back here about 30 years ago. So this is my home.
Yeah, that was my first time in New York City, the Big Apple. I got a scholarship to Horizons up there. I had a great time and I really enjoyed that conference.
Yeah, I mean, they really curated it beautifully with a great range of speakers, and I'm really impressed by it. I actually spoke at the very first one of the Horizons conferences about 15 years ago, and so it's I really like the way they've evolved as well. And the same fellow who curates that has also, I think, been involved in curating the huge MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver.
Absolutely, Kevin Baltic. Yeah, me and my co-founder, Ali, we got a scholarship to go this year, so we're excited to check out psychedelic science. Me and Ali actually went to my first psychedelic science, which was hers as well, back in 2017 in San Francisco.
Oh, there,
yeah.
I think it was the first talk I gave after stepping down from running the Drug Policy Alliance.
Okay, and when did you step down from that?
It was beginning of May 2017, so almost 8 years ago.
Okay. All right. So you stepped down in 2017.
Yeah.
What called the step down, and what have you been doing since?
I should give a little, for some of your listeners, just give a sense of my background, if that would be usful. So they know who I am, what I stepped down from. But I mean, essentially, I've been involved. this issue of the war on drugs and the ways in which the way we deal with drugs and drug use and drug misuse, and people involved in dealing and growing, I just feel that, well, I'm a guy who went to college when I was 18, actually up in Canada, in Montreal, and started smoking weed and also drank and just started wondering, why are people getting busted for this stuff? And then some years later, being in graduate school, trying to think what I wanted to focus my research on, really, this issue of drugs was kind of a backwater issue in the mid 80s. I'm talking 40 years ago now. People weren't all that interested in it. So but I was curious about it, not taking my career very seriously in academia. But anyway, I started working on the thing, and I actually went to work in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau, got a security clearance, wrote a classified report on drug-related money laundering. I then traveled all around Latin America and Europe, interviewing drug enforcement agents and customs agents and FBI and some CIA and prosecutors, both American and foreign, and wrote some books about the internationalization of crime and law enforcement. But at the same time, I was persuaded right from the beginning that the entire punitive prohibitionist approach was fundamentally flawed, certainly for cannabis. And it seemed to me that it went way too far in other drugs as well. And so what happened was I started teaching in the late 80s at Princeton University and wrote a piece. And at that point, in the late 80s, most of your listeners are probably too young to remember this, but that was when all of a sudden the war on drugs exploded into American consciousness. I mean, there was a whole new problem with crack cocaine, and a famous basketball player, Len Bias, who died of a cocaine overdose. Both Democrats, it was a bipartisan thing. Democrats and Republicans just decided they were going to, increase penalties. I mean, treat drug dealing as worse than rape or murder, an approach towards drug users that was highly punitive, like maybe give them a little shot of treatment, but then lock them up, massive drug testing entering the workplace and all over the place. Meanwhile, and so what happened in America was, we went from having 50,000 people locked up on drug charges in 1980 to over 500,000. And then another 500,000 locked up on other offenses related to the prohibitionist policies. People getting arrested for prostitution or shoplifting because they were trying to support their illegal drug habit, or people getting involved in crime involving the drug trade, because when you have a fight in the drug trade, you don't take it to court. You land up, fighting it out with violence and all sorts of things like that. And so, and America went from having a kind of average prison population as far as the world was concerned 50 years ago to be having the biggest prison population in the world. China, with 4.5 times our population, had a smaller prison population, right? We had the highest rate of incarceration in the history of democracy. Our rate of incarceration was approaching that of like Soviet gulags in the 1930s and 40s and such. So, this seemed to me the fundamental, first of all, it became the number one issue in public opinion polls in the late 80s, early 90s. You had presidents, Reagan and Bush, giving nationally televised speeches about the drug issue. Everybody was jumping on this bandwagon. And I, together with a few people on the left and a few people on the right, some prominent intellectuals like William Buckley and Milton Friedman, a few brave politicians like the new mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, on the ACLU, we basically started to say this thing is totally fucked. I just use that word, but we, totally causing far more harm than good. And although some of the people were out and out libertarians, just wanted to legalize everything and with few controls, others like myself were saying, we need to find the right balance here. We need to try to see which of these drugs can we effectively regulate in ways that will land up resulting in an advance in health and safety. And cannabis was certainly there, maybe psychedelics and some other things as well. What can we learn from Europe, where Europeans were doing much better ways of dealing with some of these drug problems? They had a bad problem with drug-related crime and heroin in the 80s and really dramatically reduced it, not through the American method of trying to lock everybody up, which just seemed a revolving door. So anyway, I started writing and speaking as a professor. There was the beginnings of some activism happening in the late 80s, early 90s. And then in 1992, I had the good fortune to get a phone call inviting me to lunch out of the blue from a billionaire named George Soros. And at that point, he was less well known, and he also was not identified as on the left. In fact, his politics were more kind of liberal Republican or conservative Democrat at that time. But we hit it off. And one thing led to another, and I left the university, and I started up my organization, initially called the Lindesmith Center, named after Alfred Lindesmith, who was the first prominent academic to challenge conventional thinking about drug addiction and drug policy. And then after some years, created the Drug Policy Alliance, which is the organization between the two of them. I ran them for 23 years, 1994 to 2017. Drug Policy Alliance, DPA, became the biggest and most important organization working for reform of drug policy, not just in the U.S., but around the world. I mean, by the time I stepped down, we had 75 people working, 75, 80 people working around the United States, with 6, 7, 8 offices around the country, doing international work as well. At the same time, we were doing ballot initiatives, the state legislative efforts around the country, ballot initiatives to legalize first marijuana for medical purposes, and then more broadly for all adults, ballot initiatives to require treatment instead of incarceration, ballot initiatives to reform these very harsh and punitive and really ugly civil asset forfeiture laws, state legislative efforts, working in Congress, working in the courts, suing the government, very much at odds with the federal government and most state governments and most local governments, with a few allies here and there. And so that really became my passion and in the movement that I was involved in building. I mean, the organization was building DPA was really a vehicle for trying to build a bigger movement or a bigger campaign effort to change the way people thought about drugs and to change the way people thought about drug policy. And, I'd say our biggest success was with the efforts around legalizing marijuana, first for medical purposes, beginning in 1996, and then more broadly for all adults, beginning in 2012. And, once in 2016, we won California, there's a big prize there, and a bunch of other states. At that point, I think that it was sort of game over. Marijuana was going to proceed in the United States. It was going to take time, but the questions were going to become less about, are we going to end marijuana prohibition, and more about the details of how to regulate it and that sort of stuff. And that was just one of about 50 reasons why I decided to step down when I did back in 2017.
Yeah. You mentioned the treatment over incarceration, which is, someone that works in the mental health field that talks about that a lot. What are some of the successes or the kind of like in political terms or grounded conversations? What does that look like as far as change goes? What are some of the solutions that have been presented around treatment over incarceration? What has been successful and what's still being worked on?
Well, Justin, that's a big question. What I can say is the following, is that by and large, drug treatment in the United States, I mean, even going back to the war on drug days in the 90s, most Americans, even in conservative parts of the country, believe that if you get arrested in possession of a small amount of drugs, heroin, cocaine, whatever, well, you should give that person a chance or two to try to get their stuff together before you lock them up. And if they can't get it together, then lock them up, right? I mean, that's been generally the American approach, and it persists to some extent today. Now, from my perspective, that was potentially better than locking people up, except sometimes the treatment alternative to incarceration became a matter of 2 steps forward and 3 or 4 steps backward, where you'd have people who say, okay, give me a chance at treatment, I'm going to try. But then when they fail, they end up getting locked up and spending more time in the grip of the criminal justice system simply because they had a problem using drugs, not because they were robbing or stealing or hurting other people, simply because they had addiction. And if you think about addiction, you think about cigarettes, right? I mean, most heroin addicts, when you ask heroin addicts, what's the toughest drug to quit? They'll say heroin, right? And that's true of addicts of a whole lot of other things. I mean, they'll say tobacco. I'm sorry. Heroin addicts will say tobacco is the hardest drug to quit, cigarettes, right? But we know most people who try to quit smoking cigarettes, it doesn't happen the first time. Some people, or the second time. Sometimes it's 5 times or 10 times or 20 times. And by the time you quit, you don't actually know if you've ever been a fully quit cigarette smoker until the day you're on your deathbed. You go, oh my God, I didn't smoke for the last 20 years, right? We know with alcohol, same sort of thing. I mean, yeah, my God, maybe even harder than cigarettes is food. Food is kind of, in some respects, the people get into problems with food, and that's become a pervasive issue in America now and many other countries. So the notion that somebody's addicted to heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine, and we're going to say, okay, we'll give you 1 or 2 tries to stop. And if you're not totally abstinent, well, then we got to lock you up. It was just something fundamentally wrong. And so part of my view on drug use was that, I have 3 core principles here. The first one is freedom. People should not be punished for what we put in our bodies, absent harm to others, right? And nobody deserves to be punished or discriminated against for what we put in our body if we're not hurting anybody else. So whether it's cigarette or alcohol or some type of food, or whether it's cocaine or heroin or mushrooms or LSD, whatever, If you're not hurting anybody else or getting behind the wheel of a car and putting other people at risk, you do not deserve to be punished. The second principle, though, is responsibility, right? We have an obligation to our fellow human beings, our fellow citizens, not to victimize them. And so for people who get addicted, and then they say, oh, well, the reason I knocked that old lady over the head and stole her money, or the reason I stole my parents', silverware, or the reason I did this or that was because I have an addiction, so don't punish me because I had an addiction. I don't accept that. I don't accept that. People need to be held responsible for their actions, right? Now, the third principle, though, is compassion, which is, yes, people need to be held responsible, but a lot of times from both the perspective of the individual who's got the drug problem and from the perspective of the family and from the perspective of the community and from the perspective of broader how we spend taxpayer money, it may actually make a lot more sense, even though they deserve to be punished, to give them the possibility of treatment, right, if they've been involved in a crime that hurt other people, and to give them multiple times and to incentivize them to succeed. Unfortunately, it's been tough going in the U.S. selling that. I mean, it's spread, and that's what harm reduction to some very good extent is about, is accepting that drugs are here to stay, and we have no choice but to learn how to live with them so they cause the least possible harm, both to the users and to the broader society. Harm reduction, the notion that people need to sometimes take one step at a time. They just can't be expected to become abstinent right away. Harm reduction in the sense that although abstinence may be the best way to stay out of trouble with drugs, that for some people, finding a way to control your drug use, to moderate your drug use, so you're doing it in a responsible way. So if you drink or you use other drugs, you don't do it in the morning when you get up. You don't do it when the little kids are around. You don't do it before work. You don't do it behind the wheel of a car. And that if you can get your drug use in a responsible way, and in fact, the vast majority of Americans are in fact responsible drug users. They're not doing harm to other people. And that's even true with heroin and cocaine, right? I mean, the whole system makes it illegal and therefore harder to be a responsible drug user. So I think part of what went wrong in America was we took a kind of abstinence ideology. Some of that came out of old American ideas going back to the Puritans. Some of it came out of the 12-step movement, which has been hugely beneficial for so many people. But the 12-step movement in AA and NA, that's all about one step at a time. You fall off the wagon, get back on. It's not a profit-driven system. It's about providing peer support. I have a lot that I admire about AA and NA. But what happened is that 12-step approach, that once you've had a drug problem, you can never, ever again use any other drug. First of all, that's not actually true for many people. In fact, many people who've had a problem with cocaine can actually live a perfectly normal life with alcohol or marijuana. Or people who had a problem with alcohol can be fine with marijuana. You know what I mean? So it wasn't actually a legitimate position in terms of what the research and the science and people's lived experience shows you. But then that abstinence-only system got married to the coercive, punitive criminal justice system. And so we started, oftentimes the only way in many parts of America you could get drug treatment was by getting arrested. I mean, think how crazy that is. The only way to get a treatment program would be to get arrested and then to be told, okay, here's treatment. And then like methadone maintenance. I mean, that came around in the 60s, 70s. The evidence overwhelmingly showed in the U.S. and around the world that for people who are addicted to street heroin, that if you could get into a good methadone program, right, that in fact, that was the best way of putting that illegal heroin problem behind you. The best way of getting out of a criminal life, the best way of getting out of addiction. And that methadone might become, the thing that you would take not just every day, but maybe for the rest of your life. And so some people say, oh, no, methadone is just substituting one addiction for another. Or you're going to be on it for, and a lot of people I know who are on methadone would say, you know what? I've been on methadone for 10, 15 years. I'm no more a methadone addict than a diabetic is an insulin addict. And I'm not getting high off that methadone. It's my daily medication, right? And I take it and I don't, and I can drive a car. I can make love with my husband or wife. I can have a job. I mean, it's my daily medicine. Doesn't work for everybody. And now there's another drug, buprenorphine, like that. But, the stigma against people on methadone became a huge issue. So, what the tragedy is we can look outside the U.S., which Americans are not typically inclined to do, and see where other countries, many other countries, have found much more effective, better ways of reducing the problems associated with drugs, right? just by being more grounded in common sense and in what science and the research shows, And now, of course, your podcast is about psychedelics. Now we're seeing the tremendous potential of psychedelics to help people dealing with a whole range of conditions, including addiction.
Yeah, something that keeps coming up for me in this is, the relative, before I get into it, when did the word addiction arise in the consciousness of humanity? When did we start using that word?
Great question. There's a classic article by a friend of mine, Professor Harry Levine at Queens College in New York, and he wrote a piece called The Discovery of Addiction. And it was really about how, I think it goes back to the 1700s, 1800s, Benjamin Rush, who I think was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. It was in ways in which the notion of addiction evolved in terms of how we think about it. And I actually don't remember all the details of the article anymore, but it's been around for a few hundred years. And obviously, it goes back much further than that in terms of people looking at people's bad habits, right? Sometimes we call it bad habits, right? Or other things. Because we know that, throughout history, sometimes because just the way people are wired, sometimes because, when we ask the question, why do some people, there's a guy named Andrew Weil. I don't know if any of your listeners are familiar with Andrew Weil, W-E-I-L. Right? He's still a major figure now in his early 80s, still out there in a big way, Dr. Andrew Weil. But he wrote a book called The Natural Mind over 50 years ago. And he asked, why do some people manage to use drugs perfectly fine and other people will end up getting in trouble? And other people like Norman Zimberg, or even Timothy Leary, the early LSD guru, talked about the notion of drug set and setting. Understanding what drugs do to you is not just about the drug, but the set, which is what you think drugs will do, how you think they'll impact, and the setting, which is what your community, your culture says about the drugs. So we know that there's been, both responsible drug use for dealing with pain, for spiritual, religious reasons, for recreational reasons, for pleasure, for whatever, going back, thousands, if not 10,000s of years. There's a book by a guy named Abel called Marijuana, the First 10,000 Years. And we know that opium goes back many, many thousands of years and was always the great way of relieving pain and was always something that most people could use responsibly, but some people ended up getting in trouble with. So I think that, part of my whole thing in the broader drug policy reform and harm reduction movement is to say, there's never been a drug-free society, more or less, maybe here and there. There's never going to be a drug-free society. And therefore, the challenge for us as individuals, communities, and societies, it's not how do we get rid of drugs. It's not how do we build a moat or a wall between our children and these drugs or between ourselves and these drugs, because ultimately that's impossible. The challenge is how do we learn how to live with these plants and chemicals in such a way that they cause the least possible harm and the greatest possible good. You look at the opioid issue, right? We still need opioids. Opioids are essential for dealing with pain. And all the cannabis and the psychedelics are going to help in different ways, but they're not going to address all the types of pain that opioids work for, right? And the question becomes, we need opioids, and yet we also are aware, certainly in Appalachia, but really throughout America, about how much opioids have been misused and led to really death and suffering and all sorts of other things. And that requires rational, sensible, pragmatic, compassionate ways of dealing with the reasons people use opioids, some of which involve physical pain, some of which involve emotional pain, some of which involve spiritual emptiness, some of which involve you name it.
So this it's a good segue into what I was kind of leaning into, which is addiction, it's kind of a meta perspective, but is addiction and the way we've come to think about it in regards to anything, because now it's becoming more accepted that you can go to like AA 12-step kind of meetings for gambling, for food, for different things. And is the conversation itself leaning into a kind of more meta perspective of a kind of spiritual adulthood for humanity? Like, can we all engage in a bit more nuance in the discussion around our relationship to each other, our relationship to plants, our relationship to drugs? And how do we bring in the context and how do we remove that immediate judgment for, using it once, kind of like you said, in some of the depths of that 12-step ideology that said, if you ever use a substance again, like you're a complete failure. Now, it's to me, it's perhaps from the more meta perspective is the question, as a species, can we engage with other in a more reasonable and nuanced fashion around our use of these? Because, as you said, some people are clearly improving their lives through insights that they gain through different substances. And yes, some people do go into a completely negative downward spiral.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, it's a great question. I think, of course, the answer is if we could go there into a more spiritually, now we know that assigning people to churches or religion doesn't work, but we do know that people who are drawn to a spiritual engagement, whether it's in a traditional or religious institution, a church or what have you, or through some other means, that they, in fact, do have better chances of avoiding drug problems or getting out of a drug problem. We know that. We also know that the medical profession is oftentimes profoundly misinformed. So I sometimes think of it, if you look what's happened, say, with opioids, right? I mean, there's obviously the issue of illicit heroin, blah, 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 blah. But then if you look at the pharmaceutical opioids, we went from a period in the 1960s, 70s, 80s into the 90s where we had a real problem of the undertreatment, the underutilization of opioids to treat pain, right? Where, especially for acute pain, whether it was children with burns or whether it was people going through cancer pain or people who are terminally ill, and where we knew that these things work, but there was a pervasive, what was called an opiophobia, and an irrational fear of opioids. And it resulted in huge numbers of people literally dying in pain, dying prematurely, because if your pain is not properly managed, you will die oftentimes sooner because the pain exhausts your mind and your body. And then we have this thing emerge in the late 90s, early 2000s associated with Purdue, Pharma and OxyContin. But in fact, it was a whole spectrum of the pharmaceutical companies and distributors. In a way, Purdue Pharma and OxyContin got labeled and they were a major player. But it's the way we talk about a copy machine as Xerox, or the way we talk about, tissue as Kleenex, we're the dominant brand, or the way we talk about naloxone as Narcan, we're a dominant brand, it lands up becoming the common word. But then what happened is, they started promoting opioids aggressively for the treatment of chronic pain. Now, it is effective for some types of people and for some types of chronic pain, but they promoted it in a gross and irresponsible way. And we're making, money head over foot from this sort of stuff. And now, beginning after 5, 6, 7 years ago, by 2005, 6, 7, you began to see the real crackdown on this stuff, right? On the companies, and then doctors started to be warned not to prescribe this, and pharmacists, and, some of this was illegal, or quasi-legal pill mills getting shut down. Some of it was doctors just not knowing any better. And so you began to see a significant reduction in the use of pharmaceutical opioids. And then, of course, what comes up is heroin, which has always been around. And people who can't get their pharmaceuticals anymore are now switching to the illicit market, and getting it that way. And then, of course, that then shifts over to illegal fentanyl. I mean, there's legal fentanyl, which is what people get in a hospital after surgery, right? But then there's the illegal fentanyl. I mean, and I look at this whole thing, and now we have a problem where people who actually, need opioids to deal with acute pain post-surgery, they're not getting it, or they're getting too little, and they're in agony. And there's no good medical reason for that, because when you're overseeing the treatment of pain, acute pain, post whatever, people are by and large not getting addicted from that. It just needs to be managed properly. And the other thing that's happening is you have people who've been living with chronic pain, and there are hundreds of thousands of them in America, if not millions, for whom the opioids, even though opioids are not the recommended approach for dealing with chronic pain, they do in fact work for lots of people. And so you have people who have been stable on opioids, even high-dose opioids, which has taken away their pain, oftentimes enabled them to work and live, normal lives. And all of a sudden they're being told by the doctors, sorry, I can't prescribe this opioid, even though you're not evidencing any problems and even though it seems to be working for you. And these people are now going to the black market. They are committing suicide. They are living in agony, right? In fact, I've joined the advisory board of an organization called NPAC, NPAC. I urge people to look it up, National Pain Advocacy Center, I think it stands for. I heard about Kate Nicholson. And it's about addressing this issue of the pendulum having been here and then swinging back from too much underprescribing, too much overprescribing going the other way. And we seem to have a problem, especially in America, it's true of other countries, of just finding the right balance there, right? Now, I'll also tell you, I look at my own personal experience with pain, and I went through, really some horrific issues with lower back pain and sciatica when I was in my 20s and early 30s. I mean, where you almost begin to feel suicidal and you think the pain's never going to go away, and it just gets in the way of everything. It's horrific. And I had the MRIs and CAT scans. You got 2 herniated discs, the L4, L5, and L5S1. Yeah. And then they were going to recommend surgery. In fact, they did recommend surgery. I was 48 hours away from surgery. I called my friend Andy Weil. I brought him up before because he'd written this book, The Natural Mind, of why people why people can manage their drugs or why people use drugs. And he said, Ethan, don't do it. He goes, what I think you should do is read a book by a guy named John Sarno, Sarno. And for any of your listeners who are struggling with chronic pain, especially back pain or sciatica, but it might also apply to other types of chronic pain, I encourage reading this book. I mean, he's written a bunch of books. So this is the book he wrote back in the 80s called Healing Back Pain. And Sarno made the case, a really fascinating case, that in fact, for people with herniated discs, that was a pretty normal part. It turned out when you did these studies, and if you randomly took 100 people who had herniated discs and 100 people who had nothing showing up in their discs, you would see the same incidence of lower back pain or sciatica in both groups. And that the whole notion that that's what was causing the back pain or sciatica was not right. And so Sarno had a much deeper explanation of what was going on in terms of it being about underlying emotional pain. And I'll tell you, when you first read it, you think this is crazy. There's no way that underlying emotional pain could be causing this intensity and level of pain, or it could cause me to lose feeling in my foot or cause my back to swing in different ways. But in fact, he was right. And so when I look at what happened in America, Appalachia was really the epicenter of this for quite a while, and in some respects remains so. What I oftentimes see is a system of people really dealing with deep-seated underlying emotional pain, spiritual emptiness that they're not able to deal with up in their head, and that the brain, according to Sarno, plays a little trick and turns that emotional pain you're not dealing with into physical pain. And it means that the cure also lies in your mind.
Which is interesting because you still kind of get the attention towards that thing that you want the attention towards, but it's kind of indirect, right? Because you're going to tell others, I have back pain, or I have shoulder pain or whatever. And people are going to listen to you. And that's really kind of what your soul wants. It's saying, hey, I have this thing that's unresolved inside of my being, and you're getting attention for it. But is it, being nurtured and resolved? So how did that resolve for you, if you don't mind sharing?
For me, after having these 3 horrific attacks of back pain sciatica in my 20s, early 30s, I embraced the Sarno approach. And it was like a miracle. I mean, in a way, Sarno takes you 90% of the way towards accepting his approach by just demolishing all the other conventional theories and giving all this evidence. But he can't prove it. And the last 10% was almost an element of faith healing, where you actually have to say, you know what? There's actually nothing physically wrong with my back. What's going on is in here. And I need to accept that fact. And obviously it's useful to try to do some reflection and to try maybe go to a therapist or whatever and try to figure out what is that underlying emotional pain I'm not dealing with. But it transformed my life. It transformed my understanding of the mind-body relationship. And after that happened, I had one recurrence about 7 years later of back pain, but I stuck to the Sarno approach and I worked it through that way again. I thought back then I was going to never be able, I couldn't, my daughter then was 3 years old. I couldn't pick her up. I thought I would never be able to go to the gym and lift weights or play ball again. So, now I'm now almost 68. And I walk around like there's nothing wrong with my back, I don't have to be careful about anything. And so, look, a lot of people, are leading difficult lives. And mind you, listen, we have a system too, right? We have a system where, first of all, Americans, more than many other cultures, are a pill-popping culture, and we want our pain taken away right away. So give me the pill. We have doctors and nurses who are not well trained in dealing with pain, who have very limited time to deal with their patients because of the way healthcare works in America. And when a patient comes in and says, I need the pill, I need the prescription, it's easier to just write that prescription and get them out of the office, right? Thirdly, we have a health insurance system that would rather pay for pills, which are relatively cheap, compared to paying for physical therapy or psychological therapy or the behavioral interventions that would actually make a real difference. And then fourthly, we have pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical distributors that have a huge interest in wanting to make money from selling this stuff, right? And then we have a government that's not really very effective at looking at how we deal with all this stuff anyway, right? And so I think we have, and then mind you, we also know, I mean, this was true 30 years ago, maybe it still is, that the number one cause in America of missed days of work is lower back pain. And if you look at people going out on disability, oftentimes it has to do with my back or whatever. So we also have a system which says, hey, this is a legitimate cause of suffering for which you can take time off, for which you can get disability, for which you can stop working. You look at other societies which don't recognize lower back pain as a legitimate source of missing days of work or disability, and dramatically lower levels of lower back pain reported in those societies, right? So there's a kind of whole head trip going on in our culture. And so I'm kind of, on the one hand, saying, listen, there are people for whom opiates work, and you need it for dealing with acute pain, and for people who have chronic pain where it's been working, let them keep taking it. But on the other hand, let's accept the fact that a lot of these people may be having a experience of physical pain that is actually emotional at its depths. Once again, to your listeners who are suffering or who know people are, get that book by John Sarno, Healing Back Pain. He died a few years ago, documentary about him, but it's really, I hope, as I am with Robert Kennedy becoming the new head of Health and Human Services, I think he's going to do a huge amount of harm in a range of areas, but I can only hope he's going to do some good in other areas. I worry about him with the drug issue because, he was a heroin addict and he embraced the 12-step approach. And there's oftentimes a belief that what would work for me is the way everybody should do it. And so I'm very hoping, without a lot of basis, that he's going to be a supporter of harm reduction. But I don't know. It was also interesting that I heard from somebody that when he was testifying before Congress, he was chewing on one of those nicotine pouches, Zyn or On, which people use to try to quit smoking. And then sometimes other people use because it makes them give us more energy. I think he was probably using it for his anxiety while he was testifying there. But I'll be very curious to see. I'm only hoping and praying that the net good that comes from him being in that position exceeds the problems he causes. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's a dicey situation. Feels totally unpredictable. It feels like some of the things that he could do could really shift drug and psychedelic policy, and some of the things he could do could totally rack decades of work from a lot of people.
Yeah. The other thing is, one thing in the psychedelics area, it's almost all was funded until a year or two ago by private, for-profit investment. I mean, first, the not-for-profit investment by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, which, had that 30-year effort and is still doing it to try to get MDMA approved by the FDA for dealing, with PTSD and other conditions, and unfortunately had the setback last year. The other funding is coming from for-profit companies, which is okay, except ultimately it's once again that model of let's create drugs only, let's put it all on a for-profit basis, which creates perverse incentives when you're trying to treat illness. And the government, National Institute of Health, was finally beginning to fund some studies in this area. And now with all the slash and burn approach to government funding in some of these areas, we'll have to see whether they're going to keep funding research on psychedelics. And,
There's a bill up in Virginia, SB 1101, and one of the notes in it is this public-private partnership clause, which I've seen in other areas. Do you know much about that? Can you explain any context about what a public-private partnership would look like in regards to?
I don't know that. I don't know any details about the Virginia bill, but private partnerships, when done right, have been done in all sorts of areas where, government works with, private for-profit investors, whether it's building housing, whether it's doing a whole range of other things. And presumably, look on a lot of drug development and a lot of development of new technologies. A lot of times that stuff is initiated by government. I mean, you look at some of the like the internet, right, came initially out of research by the government, by the Pentagon and intelligence agencies, I believe. A whole host of things have come out of that and then move into the private side. Sometimes they're a collaboration where you have people working in the private world. Back in the old days, there was something called Bell Lab when AT&T had a kind of national monopoly or something on phone systems, and they could afford to have a massive research institution, which produced amazing amounts of innovative research that helped, advance technological development. So public-private can work in some interesting ways. but I don't know the details of what's going on there.
Yeah, yeah. I was just curious about it because I'm still wrapping my brain around it. In other words, like, could the public receive financial dividends or something? Is that something in line with what a public, not necessarily the one in Virginia, but in general, a public-private partnership? I know Brian Hubbard put that forward in Kentucky with the Ibogaine initiative. So, yeah, is there anything
Yeah.
else you'd like to say about that before we move on
Yeah,
to something
no, I
else?
don't know much about the private-public thing. I am interested. I mean, so I saw I'm going to be on a panel with Brian Hubbard. He was the guy working in the, what was it, Georgia government? No, the Kentucky government.
He was in Kentucky. Now he's in Ohio with Reed Foundation, reaching everyone.
Ohio. But we're both going to be in Iceland next week at the
Oh, yeah.
Iceland Ellis Conference. And I think
In
I'm going
Reykjavik.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, the results of this research involving MDMA, ketamine, ibogaine, psilocybin, LSD. I mean, there's now probably hundreds of studies around the world. DMT is another one. And whether it's dealing with pain, whether it's dealing with addiction, whether it's dealing with PTSD, whether it's dealing with anorexia, whether it's dealing with other mental health conditions that manifest physically. And people think even possibly dealing with straight out physical conditions, or like things like, will it end up being, the research of Gould Dolan, Dole, about this way that her theory about how psychedelics work is by taking you back to a kind of the early learning period in the brain. And so might it actually be helpful in helping people deal not just with recent traumas, but even go back to things like people who stutter, people who, you just don't know, but there's
Paul Stamets had the breakthrough on the stutter on one of his early mushroom. Have you heard that story from Paul Stamets?
No.
It was like one of his early mushroom experiences where I forget how much, it was definitely a high dose psilocybin mushroom experience. And he had dealt with a stutter for his entire early life. And he like climbs to the top of this tree in the middle of a storm and just has this breakthrough. And never stutters again post psilocybin.
I do remember that. By the way, if I could just say, I had my own podcast for a couple of years called Psychoactive, and it's still on all the channels. I encourage people to listen to it. It's 80 episodes I did, including with Paul Stamets and Andy Weil and a range of others, on everything from the psychedelics to the opioids to cannabis to the politics to foreign, you name it. So people should have a listen to that. But it reminded me also of the story of Andy Weil, talking about how he had this allergic reaction to cats. And one day he was tripping on mushroom or LSD at a friend's place, and this cat hopped onto his lap. And Andy just kind of relaxed into it and, they hung out with the cat during the, psychedelic trip. And the next day, the allergy to cats was gone, and it's like the Stamets or the stutter. So, the whole mind-body relationship and the ways in which much of we experience in terms of pain, allergic reactions, it's not like you can prescribe that, but people, the more we have greater awareness of this stuff. But look, at the same time, you look now with the issues around obesity in America, right? A big problem in Appalachia, but really throughout much of America. I mean, I'm lucky. I live on the island of Manhattan in New York City, and we walk a lot. So we actually have less of that here than most of the parts of the country. But, that also goes to the ways in which food has become this thing that's kind of, when people feel spiritual empty, feel amotivated. So it's one of the cheapest and easiest of all addictions. And in a way, the broader economic consequences for the country are now exceeding those associated with drug addictions. It's a tricky one, and it's about, people's quality of life. The truth is, when I look at these very severe problems in Appalachia, you see it also like in northern New Mexico. You see, those are places that traditionally we had multi-generational, heroin addiction, for example. And it's a part of the world I'm not as familiar with, but I think it's a part of the world where, sometimes people are not well informed and where people can feel hopeless and unfortunately it leads to a lot of suffering.
It does, it has, and it is. Yeah, I struggled with opioid use in my late teens and early 20s, and I'm from a small town in Tennessee, and for a lot of us in Appalachia, it's like, they ain't shit to do. You know what I mean? So it's real easy to get caught up and find a euphoria and joy in the use of opioids and kind of forget that there's nothing to do. Of course, there is something to do. You can find purpose and
Yeah.
connect, and there are things to do, but it feels like there's nothing to do, and it's really easy to get caught up. Well, we've got about 15 minutes or so left. I want to shift us. Well, one, I wanted to second folks to check out your podcast, Psychoactive. I've listened to several episodes. It's actually how I found out about you before I met you at the conference. Many great episodes on there. Ethan has a great way of articulating so many different things. A lot of great guests. I'm a former basketball and still a basketball player. He had Steven Jackson on, and I learned about his podcast, and there's a lot to check out. So I do recommend our listeners check that out. For our last 15 minutes here, I was really curious if you might be able to provide a little context of opioid use and the history of opioid use. For example, this isn't the first quote-unquote epidemic, as it's referred to by some. There's been many problems with it before. There's been wars fought around this plant and its derivative that we now use in its different forms. When I first learned about that, it was kind of a shock to me. I felt that in Appalachia, in the early 2000s, when it was first popping off where I'm from, it was like, this is like singular to us. But actually, there's a lot of context and history around it being presented in different communities and being a problem in different communities, and the wars fought around it. Can you give us any context on that?
Broadly, obviously opium's been used throughout much of the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It also can grow almost everywhere. It used to grow extensively in the United States and in England, and a little bit like cannabis. It can really grow in huge numbers of places. People may have heard about the famous opium wars of the mid-19th century, when there was a whole kind of triangular trade involving the Great Britain and India and China. And India had an interest in selling, moving opium from India to China and then getting goods from China. And when China's tried to stop that, it was Britain, launched this ugly war known as the Opium Wars. But it's a complicated history because, opium has been used throughout history in various cultures by most people in a responsible way. It was the only thing available to deal with pain in most cultures. Both in this country and England and elsewhere, oftentimes when mothers had babies, and if the babies, were crying or couldn't sleep, whatever, or if they, were teething, they would take a tiny bit of a little bit of opium and just, or more than just rub it on the gum. And that was an accepted medical practice. And of course, every year, some small number of babies would die because the parents rubbed too much on there and do something dumb. But for the vast majority, it was just part of what you did. And this was from Asia to America, the whole world. In the mid-19th century or in late 19th century, the principal consumers of opioids were middle-aged women, white women. And most of them used it for dealing with aches and pains. That back then they didn't have anything to, you're going through menopause, you're going through this or that. Remember, they didn't have aspirin until 1898. They didn't have penicillins. People, suffering from diarrhea, and nothing stops you up the way opioids do. A little bit of opium and, stops the diarrhea. So it was a huge thing. But inevitably, some people would take too much of it and they would get addicted to it. Some people, it was so easy to get through the mail or in shops that some people would use it daily and they wouldn't even know they were addicted any more than people think of themselves as being addicted to coffee, right? And if they were using it in moderation, it was fine. But it could also be a problem where people would, use too much and get kind of out of it and what have you. But nobody thought about making it illegal because nobody wanted to put their, their middle-class white auntie or grandma behind bars. And it was only when opium became identified with the Chinese immigrants. These Chinese come into America, work on the railroads and the mines, working 14 hours a day, 6-7 days a week. And at the end of the day, they go back to their encampment or whatever and smoke a little opium like they had back in the old country. In the same way that white people would go and have a bunch of drinks at the end of the day. But these were the alien Chinese people, and they were doing their opium. And then the fear went out, these Chinamen are going to be addicting and enslaving our precious white women to drugs and all this stuff. And so the first opium prohibition laws were in California and Nevada back in the 1880s. They're basically directed at Chinese minorities. And so that was some of the origins of this stuff. And then we moved towards the criminalization. Huge numbers of doctors prescribed morphine. Heroin emerged in 1898. Bayer Pharmaceutical put two new drugs on the shelf. One was aspirin, and the other one was heroin in a pill form. And it was a cough suppressant because it is a very effective cough suppressant. And once again, as far as we know, most people used it responsibly without a problem, but some people were not, And And then paradoxically, as we cracked down on the importation of opium, that helped to lead to the shift of heroin. Because whenever you crack down on an illicit product that is bulky and smelly, the people who smuggle pretty quickly figure out, well, let's not ship opium anymore. Let's start shipping heroin because that's far more compact and it doesn't smell as much, and therefore we'll make more profit and be less likely to get caught. It's one of what they call the iron laws of prohibition. Or there was a wonderful article that an academic named Joe Westermeyer wrote 50 years ago in the Bulletin of Archives of General Psychiatry called The Pro-Heroin Effects of Anti-Opium Laws. He showed every Asian country that had a kind of opium control system, kind of like the methadone system, where most older people could go and buy opium legally. Now, when they cracked down on that system, what happened was they reduced the number of old people using opium, but within a few years in every one of these countries, all of a sudden a whole illegal heroin market emerged that was more appealing to young people and to people getting involved in criminal behavior, and it all just backfired, right? So, this has been an issue out there for a long time. Back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, 60s, and then 70s, heroin was associated with, black communities, Harlem, who were getting serious heroin problems, right? Before that, it had been pharmaceuticals. You read the novel by semi-autobiographical novel, Junkie by William Burroughs, one of the early figures in the psychedelic area too. But he talks about, back in the 50s, there wasn't that much heroin around. So what you did was you tried to get doctors and pharmacists who were either ignorant or corrupt to give you a script, right? Sort of like what happened in the modern days, or else you robbed a pharmacy, right? But I sometimes think, that, it's an interesting little thought experiment. Imagine if when that whole thing happened with the pharmaceutical opioids back in the early 2000s, and the number of annual overdose fatalities increased from about 5,000 a year to 15 or 20,000 a year, right? And then there was the crackdown, and then heroin emerged from Mexico, and then fentanyl. Sometimes I wonder what if what had happened, what if they never cracked down, or the crackdown had been less harsh in a way, so that people could still get a pharmaceutical opioid prescription pretty easily, the way you would for Valium or for Viagra or something like that. And, I sometimes think if we had continued to have what you might call a leaky pharmaceutical system, it might have prevented a lot of the switch towards illegal heroin and then fentanyl. Now, you can never recommend as a public policy matter that the best system is a leaky pharmaceutical system. You can't, let's have a leaky pharmaceutical system as a public policy. But if you think about it conceptually, it might well be that system, which was, if we'd allowed the system to continue to be leaky while stopping some of the aggressive promotion by the pharmaceutical companies, maybe we would not have merged with the fentanyl problem. And the fentanyl thing, the emergence of fentanyl, was really a game changer, because until fentanyl came around, most what were called heroin overdose fatalities were actually more accurately described as fatalities associated with fatal drug combinations. Relatively few people died from taking heroin by itself. Most people who died of an overdose before fentanyl, it was because they were combining heroin or another opioid with alcohol or with benzodiazepines, tranquilizing drugs. And it was that combination, when you combine heroin and alcohol, opioids and alcohol, or opioids and benzos, right? Together, if you do it in a moderate way, it can feel great. But the problem is, if you double the dose, you can die, stop your breathing, right? So it's a thing that makes you feel really good at that combination, but is very dangerous to play with. But when fentanyl came around, you could be using just fentanyl, nothing else, no booze, no benzos, and you could just land up dead because it was 1,500 times more potent per gram than heroin. And in the early years, oftentimes, the drug dealers didn't even know what they were doing, or they'd be mixing up the drugs and the cuts in a blender. So you'd get, a batch, and this batch would have almost no fentanyl in it, and another little batch would have too much fentanyl in it. And so, and then meanwhile, the government comes along and says, well, we don't really believe in harm reduction. We don't want to have drug testing programs where people who are using drugs illegally can have their drugs tested. We don't want to open up a needle exchange program. We don't want to open up a safe drug use site, even though huge evidence around the world that when you open up a drug consumption room where people who are using drugs illegally can use them in a kind of protected place with a nurse present, people say, how can you do that? How can you spend government money on allowing illegal drug users to use their drugs in a consumption room, right? But the bottom line is you look at these things now exist in over a dozen countries around the world, and they've prevented tens, if not hundreds of thousands of overdose fatalities. They've gotten drug users off the streets. They create less of a public safety, public nuisance problem. There's from a straight dollars and cents, save lives, it makes all the sense in the world. But you need to understand that. And you look at places like, West Virginia, where they had a needle exchange program, they shut it down. Or with the notion of having a drug consumption room, even the Biden administration couldn't get behind it because they knew that if they got behind it, the Republicans would pummel them on making life easy on drug users, on junkies, right? So, it's fentanyl has been a game changer. The thing that's interesting to ask is, why is America and Canada among the only countries in the world that's really had this fentanyl problem? And part of it, I think, is because the European countries dealt effectively with their heroin problem back 20, 30 years ago through harm reduction and other means. Now there's a concern that with Afghanistan, in America, we get most of our heroin and fentanyl from Mexico, but in much of the rest of the world, most of the heroin was coming from Afghanistan, including Europe. With the Taliban having taken over and with them supposedly having a really somewhat effective crackdown on opium and heroin production, one of the concerns is that Europe may now see the emergence of fentanyl because heroin is becoming less available. We'll have to see whether or not that happens. Hopefully it doesn't, because there's not been a big demand for illicit heroin. But, just my view is, I have to say you too, when I go to, I'm doing this less these days, but I would go and speak at, marijuana legalization conferences, and I hear people demonizing the opioids and saying, stop all the opioids, marijuana is the solution, right? Or maybe psychedelics. And I would say, shut the hell up. Because yes, marijuana can be effective in psychedelics, but you still need opioids for dealing with various types of pain. And then I go to the pain conferences, and I say, how many of you in this audience here, the pain docs and others, how many of you are familiar with the role of marijuana, of cannabis in dealing with pain? And very few hands would come up. And I said, what the hell are you doing? Of course, we always need opioids, but cannabis can play an effective role. Cannabis can be a much less risky way of dealing with certain types of pain, neuropathic pain, and a range of others where opioids don't work that well. And we also know that combining cannabis with opioids is not dangerous, but that you can sometimes cut the opioid dose in half or less. And if you have a little cannabis with it, it actually gives you the same pain relief effect as the higher dose of the opioids would. So people just need to be better informed about this sort of stuff. You look at some of the areas in Appalachia, where government's been pretty backward about this stuff. They took forever to start opening needle exchange programs. They wouldn't even imagine opening a drug consumption room. You still got a lot of stigma associated with methadone and buprenorphine. You still got a lot of very little harm reduction in the way of harm reduction programs, a lot in the way of abstinence-only programs, a lot of the way of putting drug treatment through the criminal justice system. So, one problem you have in Appalachia is still continuing to do things ass backwards in dealing with a really serious problem, even when other parts of the country and the world have kind of figured out a better way. But because of the politics or the ignorance, people say, not for us, not for us. We just as soon have our people keep dropping like flies or suffering rather than try something new. And that's a real tragedy. There's no excuse for that type of, perpetuating ignorance and ineffective and backward policies. Let me, if I could, Justin, one issue I did want to bring up in the last minutes here is the issue I'm quite passionate about is the issue of tobacco harm reduction. And that's about people who smoke cigarettes. And that's a significant issue in Appalachia. And it's an issue especially among, poor, middle class, whatever, white men oftentimes and women now. And if they can't quit smoking and they've tried the patches and they've tried the prescription drug, we now know that trying to switch over to an e-cigarette or a heated tobacco product, so I think the most popular one is called IQOS, or these pouches, Zyn and On, we know there's strong evidence that those things can be very effective at helping people quit smoking, right? And we know that for people who try them, that just because you've tried one or two e-cigarettes and it hasn't worked, it means you got to keep trying different brands and trying different flavors, and then maybe try the heated tobacco product like IQOS, and then try the pouch. You have to keep trying things till you find the one that works for you. But what happens is, in part, because there's an abstinence ideology now where government and others have become not just anti-smoking, but anti-nicotine, and where there's tremendous ignorance. Nicotine does not cause cancer. but most Americans, including most doctors, think it does. Nicotine is addictive, but it doesn't do all that much harm to the human body. You can live to be 90 or 100 using nicotine. It's the smoking, the burnt particle matter, which is so deadly, right? And then what happened, back right before the pandemic, when there was this epidemic of kids, vaping with e-cigarettes, and all these parents started to freak out. And it was understandable that nobody wanted their kids, vaping. But in fact, the risks of that were dramatically less than smoking. And meanwhile, the fact that there's still 30 million plus American smokers out there who really need to be encouraged to switch. We need to get both the tobacco companies, which are already moving towards switching out of combustible cigarettes into these other non-combustible things, and consumers. We need to do everything possible with regulatory policy, tax policy, public education to get people to switch. And meanwhile, discourage young people from doing it. And in fact, vaping among young people has fallen dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years. But understand that the risks to young people of vaping are real, but dramatically small compared to the benefits of adult smokers of stopping smoking. And if they can't quit, using an e-cigarette or a heated tobacco product or a pouch or something like that. People need to know this. And the fact that a majority of Americans think that vaping is as or more dangerous than smoking, when in fact vaping appears to be only 5 or 10% as dangerous as smoking. Most Americans don't know that. The fact that they believe, as I said, that nicotine causes cancer, when in fact it doesn't, it hooks you, but it's the smoking that causes the cancer. Nicotine has got minimal association with cancer. I mean, people need to know that stuff. And this is still the thing, killing more Americans prematurely than even opioids at an older age than with opioids, but it's still in the area of, 400,000 or 500,000 people dying prematurely each year because they couldn't quit smoking when they got older.
That's a lot of important context for tobacco, and we've had a lot of important context for a lot of substances, and we're really appreciating all of your time and insight on these things, Ethan. So I know folks can get involved with Drug Policy Alliance. They can get involved with us. What are some ways, if people are feeling inspired in any way in this conversation, to educate or get more involved in policy or anything? They can check out Drug Policy Alliance. What else can they do?
There's so many good organizations out there. There's the Harm Reduction Coalition in the U.S., Harm Reduction International, working globally. There's some good, there's a website, I think it's called Counterfactual, by a guy named Clive Bates, who's the leading expert in the world on tobacco harm reduction and that sort of stuff. I encourage people to look at. There's something called the Global State of Harm Reduction Report, the Global State of Tobacco Harm Reduction Report by a different organization. There's tons of good sites out there about the psychedelic stuff. There are some smart, if you look around for methadone, there's a lot of smart, good information out there that people can look around and find out about. But obviously it also involves not just in their personal lives and in the lives of their family and friends, but it involves getting engaged in the schools. You mentioned earlier, Justin, you've taken a look at the Safety First project about harm reduction approach to drug education for young people. Encourage people to look at Safety First. It came out of Drug Policy Alliance. My old organization is now based at Stanford University. That can be really important. People need to, be pushing there for whether it's more psychedelics research or more, in some places in Appalachia, if you're on a methadone program, you got to drive an hour a day to get to a methadone clinic, hour each way sometimes, because of ridiculous rules. But in most countries, people can just go to a local pharmacy or their doctor and get their methadone dose each day. Once again, idiotic over-regulation in government based upon popular ignorance and fear by the public and the legislators. And so the more educated people are, cannabis. Hey, listen, cannabis, tremendous, for most people and me. It's been a really net positive in my life, it helps, but I know people who have a terrible problem with cannabis. People get delusional, people get addicted, people get lethargic. So cannabis is a real drug and we have to be smart and thoughtful about it. We got to be smartful. Best harm reduction rule ever. If you're using your drugs, better off not combining them. Even if it makes you feel a little better when you combine them, if you're going to hit the roads, cannabis is not as problematic as alcohol, but combining the two can be a real problem. So, if you've had a few drinks, don't smoke weed. If you smoked weed, don't use any alcohol. Ideally, you're not supposed to be using anything behind the wheel of a car. But if you are, you're a lot better off. You're a lot safer driver if you've only used one or the other in moderation. I mean, little basic ideas like that just really help a lot to know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's all very important. So everybody can check those out. You reminded me of something Carl Hart said at Psychedelic Science in 2023, I believe. He was talking about harm reduction, and he's like, well, also, what about benefit maximization? And I thought it was like a fun way of thinking about both sides of the equation, that yes, obviously we need to think about testing, we need to think about education. The public needs to be more informed about this, and some people are using it responsibly and finding various benefits on it.
No, exactly. It's the reason most people use most drugs is because they're getting some benefit, and it could be relaxation, it could be spiritual, it could be fun, it could be whatever. And I think the key thing, and I think Carl kind of missed this point, was if you look, where in the world are there being thoughtful and honest conversations about drugs and pleasure, drugs and positive? It's happening in the harm reduction world.
Yeah.
So, the frame of harm reduction was a pivotal one, because who could be against harm reduction, right? It was about, accepting, and for a long time, people tried to demonize the phrase harm reduction and claimed harm reduction was all about promoting drugs. It was all about legalizing all drugs. But in fact, it is in the harm reduction world where you hear the most thoughtful and honest conversations about the upside of using drugs. I think harm reduction is a term that's of great value. I mean, decades of work were put into getting it legitimized to the point where I think now a majority of governments around the world now incorporate harm reduction into their drug policies. And I think the fact that the harm reduction activism world is where the conversations are having about the beneficial sides of drugs and the pleasure aspects, I think that's all in all a very good thing. If we want to start talking about drugs and pleasure, people are going to get their back up in a huge way. We have to still talk about it. We have to have those conversations. Harm reduction was a way where people could say, hey, you can't stop using drugs. Better off for yourself, your family, your community, the society, if you understand that there are ways of reducing the harms of drug use, even if you're unable or unwilling to stop. And that was a really powerful breakthrough. And the fact that governments, and not just Democrats, but Republicans, have increasingly embraced that view is really important in terms of reducing the death, disease, crime, and suffering associated with drugs, especially illicit ones, but also more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on our website, we have Appalachian state list of all the harm reduction organizations in each Appalachian state. So folks can check that out and find some more context and maybe even get involved locally. Some chapters have closed down, but there's always the opportunity to start one. If you're feeling inspired by this, there is a lot of resources to do so.
Yeah, I do remember there was a North Carolina harm reduction group that for years was a real pioneer in the country. And I'm not sure how it's doing these days. And then North Carolina, Drug Users Union or something like that. So there have been some good groups out there in North Carolina especially, but you can find them operating in other parts of the country as well.
Well, Ethan, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think our listeners are going to find a lot of value in it, and hopefully we can have you back on. I could talk to you all day and kind of pick your brain on all these things. So is there any closing thoughts or anything you want to share before we close it out?
If people really want to reach out to me, my email address is ethan@nadelmann.net, or just Google me. You can just Google Ethan Nadelmann, or actually, quite frankly, you can Google Ethan Drug or Drug Ethan, and you'll find me just as easily that way. So I can't promise I'll respond, but if I have an opportunity to do so, and include your phone number, sometimes it's easiest for me to respond by just leaving a voicemail or something. Okay.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Catch you on the flip side.